The sky burned in shades of orange and smoke as the radio crackled with one horrifying update after another. 340 Marines, cut off, surrounded, and ridden off as lost in a remote war zone. Command said there was nothing more that could be done. Extraction was impossible. Every route in was suicide. But for Captain Elena Ross, that wasn't an order she could live with. She had served beside those men. She had trained with them, laughed with them, and promised she'd never leave anyone behind. Sitting in the dim glow of the operations tent, she stared at the map pinned to the wall, her heart pounding harder than the distant gunfire. Every red mark on that board was a man depending on hope that no longer existed, except for the hope she refused to let die. The chain of command had spoken, but her conscience had other plans. She knew that crossing that line would end her career, maybe even her life, but doing nothing would haunt her forever. When her team realized what she intended to do, the silence in the room said it all. Going back into that inferno wasn't strategy, it was madness. But something in her eyes told them she wasn't asking for permission. She was already halfway gone. Within the hour, she'd commandeered a battered convoy, loaded it with supplies, and set a course straight into the heart of chaos. Every instinct told her this mission shouldn't be possible. Every rule told her to turn back. But as the smoke thickened and the first flashes of enemy fire lit the horizon, one thing became clear. Elena wasn't just fighting to save her Marines. She was fighting for the very soul of what it means to never leave anyone behind. Elena's convoy rumbled through the broken terrain under a moonless sky. The headlights dimmed to avoid detection. Every mile they drove deeper into the war zone. The radio grew quieter, until the only sound left was the low hum of the engine and the pounding of her heart. The desert around them was littered with the wreckage of burned-out vehicles and echoes of missions that never made it back. Her team, 5 volunteers who refused to let her go alone, followed her lead without question, though the fear in their eyes said what no one dared to voice. Back at base, she had been known for her discipline, the kind of officer who followed orders to the letter. But that version of Elena had died the moment the call came in. The call that 340 Marines were trapped in a valley now controlled by enemy forces. The extraction team had been delayed, supplies had run out, and communication was nearly gone. The command had labeled them beyond recovery. To her, those words meant one thing: abandoned. She thought back to the faces of the men she'd trained, the ones who'd trusted her to bring them home. Some were barely out of training, still carrying pictures of family in their pockets. They weren't just numbers on a report. They were her responsibility, and if no one else would fight for them, she would. As the convoy neared the ridgeline overlooking the valley, the static on the radio suddenly came alive, a faint, broken voice calling for help. The team froze, scanning the darkness. Elena grabbed the receiver, her voice steady but tight. "This is Captain Ross. Hold your position. We are coming for you." But what answered back wasn't just a plea for help. It was a warning. The broken voice on the radio crackled again, this time clearer, desperate. "Captain, it's a trap. They know you're coming." The message cut off before she could respond. The words hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, no one spoke. The hum of the engines faded as Elena raised her hand, signaling the convoy to halt. Her mind raced. If the enemy knew their route, every second they stayed out here meant walking straight into danger. Her second in command, Sergeant Cole, leaned closer. "Ma'am, if that's real, we're already exposed. We turn back now. Maybe we make it out." But Elena didn't move. Something inside her refused to accept that this was the end. She scanned the ridge ahead through her scope, her breath slow and steady, trying to catch any sign of movement. There, just a flicker of light deep in the valley, where the trapped Marines were supposed to be. It could have been gunfire or a signal. Either way, it was enough to make her decision. "We keep moving," she said quietly. "They're still alive." As the vehicles rolled forward, a low rumble echoed in the distance. Thunder, or maybe something worse. The terrain grew tighter, forcing them into narrow passes lined with jagged rock. Cole watched the shadows nervously. "Feels like someone's watching," he muttered, and he wasn't wrong. Hidden eyes were tracking every move they made. Back at command, word had already spread that Captain Ross had gone rogue. Some saw her as reckless, others called her a hero. But for those stranded Marines, She was their only chance. Hours later, as the sun began to rise, the team reached the edge of the valley. Smoke drifted through the air, and faint figures moved in the distance. Elena gripped her radio, her pulse quickening. "This is Ross. We're here." But the valley answered only with silence. The silence in the valley was thick and heavy, almost alive. Elena stepped out of the vehicle, boots crunching softly against the dust. Every sense sharpened. The early light revealed faint trails, boot prints, burned-out crates, shattered gear, signs that someone had been here, and recently. Her team fanned out, weapons lowered but ready, eyes scanning every shadow. It felt too still, too quiet for a battlefield. Then came the sound, metal scraping against rock. Everyone froze. Sergeant Cole gestured toward a collapsed ridge on the left, where movement flickered beneath the rubble. Elena rushed forward, crouching low. Through the haze, she saw a hand, trembling and caked in dust. "We've got one," she called, her voice tight with hope and fear. Team dug fast, pulling out a Marine barely conscious, whispering a single word: "Ambush." Before she could ask more, the crack of gunfire split the air. The team dove for cover as dust exploded around them. It wasn't random. Whoever was out there had been waiting for them. Elena's heart pounded. They'd walked straight into the trap the voice on the radio had warned about. But retreating wasn't an option now, not with survivors nearby. She shouted commands, her voice cutting through the chaos, rallying her team to hold position. Smoke grenades hissed as they created a thin cover, but through it, Elena saw shapes moving, too many to count. Cole shouted over the noise, "We're outnumbered, Captain." She didn't answer. Her eyes locked on a flicker of light at the far end of the valley, a flare, maybe a signal from the remaining Marines. Hope and danger burned together in her chest. They had come this far. Turning back now would mean leaving them for good. And as the gunfire closed in, Elena made her choice, one that would change everything. Elena's team fought to stay low as the dust thickened and the sound of gunfire echoed through the valley walls. She could barely see 10 feet ahead, but she kept her focus locked on that faint flare in the distance. Somewhere out there, her Marines were still alive, or so she thought. Then, through the static in her headset, a new voice broke in. "Captain Ross, this is Echo Unit. You're not supposed to be there. That signal, it's not ours." The words hit her like a shockwave. The flare wasn't a rescue signal. It was bait. Before she could respond, another explosion tore through the ridge, shaking the ground beneath them. The convoy's lead vehicle flipped on its side, smoke pouring into the air. Cole dragged her behind cover, his face streaked with dirt and disbelief. "They knew we'd come for them," he said, voice trembling. "Someone gave away our route." The thought chilled her more than the enemy fire. Someone from their own side had to have leaked their mission. But why? Through the haze, movement caught her eye. A group of Marines stumbling toward them, uniforms torn, faces pale with exhaustion. Relief flooded her chest until one of her men shouted, "Captain, those aren't ours." In the chaos, she realized the truth too late. The enemy had disguised themselves, using captured uniforms to blend in. It wasn't just a trap. It was a deception built on her own compassion. She grabbed the radio again, her voice sharp and steady despite the chaos. "Echo Command, this is Captain Ross. We've been compromised, requesting immediate air support." But only static answered back. The line was dead. Surrounded, outnumbered, and betrayed from within, Elena's team was down to their final choices, and none of them led home. The air was thick with smoke and fear. Elena could barely hear her own breathing over the chaos. The team was pinned down behind what was left of their convoy, bullets cutting through the dust like angry whispers. Cole was hit, but he waved her off, insisting she keep pushing forward. Every second counted. Somewhere in that valley were the real survivors, if any still lived, and she wasn't leaving without them. Then, through the static, a faint voice broke through again. "Captain, this is Sergeant Vance. We're alive. North Ridge. Hurry." Relief washed over her for an instant until she noticed the direction. The North Ridge was on the other side of the valley, completely exposed. If they tried to cross, they'd be sitting targets. But staying meant certain death. Elena made the call. "We move," she said, pulling Cole to his feet. "We're not dying here." They sprinted through the open ground, dodging bursts of fire, explosions lighting up the dust around them. Her team covered each other, step by step, until they reached a cluster of broken rock. And there, half buried beneath debris, were the missing Marines, battered but alive. For a moment, everything froze. Against all odds, she had found them. But just as the first wave of relief hit, she saw movement behind the ridge, armored vehicles, moving fast. Reinforcements. Only. They weren't friendly. Her radio crackled again. But this time, the voice on the other end was one she recognized. "Captain Ross, stand down." "That's an order." It was command. Elena froze, realization cutting through her. The ambush, the silence, the betrayal, it all led back to them. The rescue had never been meant to succeed. They wanted her mission buried along with the truth. And as the dust settled around her, Elena understood the cost of disobedience and the price of doing what was right. The morning sun broke through the haze, casting light over the valley that had seen too much. Elena stood among the wounded Marines, her uniform torn and covered in dust. The echo of the last explosion had faded, leaving only silence and the slow rhythm of breathing, proof that, against all odds, they were still alive. Cole leaned against a rock nearby, bandaged and exhausted, watching as Elena helped one of the younger Marines to his feet. For the first time in days, there was no gunfire, no shouting, just the quiet relief of survival. Minutes later, the roar of aircraft filled the air. Real reinforcements this time, those who had finally gotten her distress signal. As they descended, medics rushed to the scene, disbelief on their faces as they counted the survivors. 340 Marines, once marked as lost, were finally coming home. Elena didn't smile, though. The truth she carried weighed heavier than the dust on her shoulders. She knew command would try to bury what happened, to hide that they had left their own people for dead. When they returned to base, Elena handed in her report, every name, every detail, and every truth they tried to erase. Some called her reckless, others whispered hero. She didn't care for either. What mattered was that her people lived. Weeks later, as she stood alone at the edge of the airfield, watching the horizon glow at sunset, she finally let herself breathe. The cost had been high, but she had kept her promise. No one left behind. The world might never know the full story, but the men and women she saved would never forget it. And deep down, Elena Ross knew that sometimes doing the right thing means standing alone, no matter the orders.